Hello everyone, I hope you're having a really nice day. Today, we're following James and Diep in one of their most painful moments, when love isn't enough to keep two people together. Diep makes a choice that shocks James, not because she stops loving him, but because she's terrified their relationship will destroy the bond between him and his father. And just when James tries to hold on, he reveals he's secretly collecting evidence proof that could change everything. It's romantic, it's tense, and it's the kind of goodbye that doesn't feel like an ending. If you enjoy emotional stories like this, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next episodes. I think we should end this. Diep's words didn't rise, they didn't tremble, they simply fell between them clean and final, like a coin dropped into deep water. James froze with his hands half open on the cafe table, as if he'd been reaching for her without realizing it. The late-night cafe was almost empty. A slow fan turned overhead. Outside, the street lamp glow slid across wet pavement, and the air smelled faintly of coffee and rain. "End," his voice caught. "Diep, what are you saying?" "Us." She didn't look away when she said it. That was the worst part. No anger, no drama, just a decision she had been carrying too long. James shook his head so hard it felt like his whole body refused to accept it. "No, don't do this. If you're scared, tell me who." "It's not someone." Diep's fingers tightened around her glass, but she didn't drink. "It's your life, your family." "My family is my problem," he said, too fast, too sharp, "not yours. That's exactly why it became mine." Her voice stayed soft, but it hit him harder than shouting would have. A few minutes earlier, he had been sitting in his car at the edge of a quiet street. City noise fading into something far away. On the passenger seat, a thin folder and a small USB drive. Not romantic, not comforting. Just proof something he couldn't even trust his own home to hold safely. Then his phone lit up. "Diep, can we talk? Just you and me." He didn't type a long reply. He sent his location. He thought that would be enough for two people, one table, one honest conversation. He didn't expect goodbye. Now, under the dim cafe light, he leaned forward like he could physically shorten the distance she was creating. "I'm not choosing anyone over you." Diep's eyes shimmered, but she held the tears back with stubborn control. "And that's what scares me, James. The more you hold on to me, the more you break apart from your father." James's jaw tightened. "My father is the one breaking things." Even hearing the word father made something ugly twist in his chest, heat and shame and a rage he had been swallowing for years. Diep swallowed hard. "Even if he's done wrong, he's still your father." James reached across the table without thinking, his hand landing near hers, not touching, asking, "Please don't do this." She looked down at his hand, then back up, as if she hated how much it still mattered. "I don't have parents, James. I grew up without that kind of bond. So when I see you standing on the edge of losing yours," her voice thinned, "I can't be the reason you fall." "You're not the reason," he said, desperate, almost pleading with her to believe it. Diep's breath shook. "Maybe not today, but one day when everything collapses, you'll look back and wonder what you traded away. I can't live with that price." James pushed back from the table, chair scraping the floor. Pain flashed across his face like lightning. So you'll leave me to protect me? That's not love, Diep. That's punishment. It's not punishment. Her hands trembled now, finally betraying her calm. It's the only way I know how to love you without destroying you. He stepped closer, lowering his voice like a vow. Then stay. Let me carry it. Let me fight for the truth and still keep you. Diep's eyes filled at last, tears slipping free. She whispered, "And if your fight costs you your father, can you promise you won't hate me for it?" James stood there, mouth parted, because the truth was he didn't know what the cost would be. And in that silence, Diep's goodbye grew heavier than the air. James's throat worked like he was swallowing glass. He stared at Diep as if the right sentence, just one, could pull her back from the edge. "I won't hate you," he said finally, voice rough. "I might hate the world. I might hate him, but not you." Diep flinched at the certainty in his tone, like it hurt to hear. She stood slowly, chair legs whispering against the floor. For a second, James thought she might sit back down, thought she might reach for his hand. Instead, she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with a trembling precision, as if she needed something small and orderly to keep from falling apart. "Then let me go while you can still say that," she whispered. James moved around the table in 2 quick steps, blocking her path, not aggressive, just desperate. His eyes were bright, the kind of bright that meant he'd already cried somewhere private and refused to admit it. "Diep, if this is about my father, I'm already in it." His voice dropped. "It's not just feelings. It's true." Diep's gaze sharpened, cautious. "What are you talking about?" James hesitated. He'd promised himself he wouldn't drag her into the worst part of his life, but she was already bleeding from it in silence, and he couldn't stand that. "I've been gathering evidence," he admitted. "Not rumors, not anger, proof, documents, records, people who saw things." His hand hovered near his jacket pocket like he could feel the weight of the USB there, even though it wasn't with him now. "I'm doing it carefully, quietly." Diep's lips parted, fear flashing through her composure. "James, that's dangerous." "I know." He gave a small, bitter laugh that wasn't humor. "That's why I didn't tell you. I didn't want you to carry it." Diep looked at him for a long moment, and in her eyes he saw the terrible math she was doing, the kind where every answer ends in loss. "So you're choosing war," she said softly. "I'm choosing the truth." His voice softened too, tender in a way that made her eyes sting. "And I wanted to choose you alongside it." Diep's breath hitched. She lowered her gaze, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. "Do you know what it's like to love someone and still feel like you're poisoning them?" James's face tightened. "You're not poisoning me. I am." Diep forced a shaky inhale. "Because once I'm in your life, everything becomes personal. Every threat becomes aimed at me. Every decision becomes for her or because of her. And then, when you face your father," her voice broke, "you'll be standing there and he'll point at me like I'm the reason you turned against him." James stepped closer, lowering his forehead toward hers without touching. The space between them hummed with everything they weren't saying. "Let him point," James murmured. "I know who I am." Diep squeezed her eyes shut, a tear spilling down her cheek. "You think you do?" The cafe door opened for a moment, letting in a gust of cold air and distant street noise. Somewhere outside, a motorbike passed, its sound fading fast, like time moving on without permission. James lifted his hand and finally, carefully touched the side of her face, wiping the tear with his thumb. His touch was warm, almost reverent, as if he was memorizing her. Diep didn't pull away. That was the cruelest mercy. "Why now?" James asked, voice trembling. "Why tonight?" Diep's mouth quivered. "Because I saw you today." He frowned, confused. "You saw me?" "I didn't mean to." Her gaze dropped to his chest, to where his heart would be. "I was passing by the street near your office. I saw you get into your car. Your hands were shaking. You looked like someone who'd been holding his breath for years." James swallowed. "And in that moment," Diep continued, "I realized you're not just hurting, you're preparing. You're stepping into something that will change you." James stared at her, the truth sitting heavy in his eyes. "I can't stay the same." "I know." Diep nodded, tears falling now without restraint. "And I don't want to be the reason you lose the last piece of yourself that still believes in family." James's jaw clenched. "Family isn't just blood." Diep gave a small, broken smile. "That's easy to say when you have it." That simple, quiet sentence split the air between them. James exhaled slowly, fighting the urge to grab her and refuse reality. Instead, he did something harder. He stepped aside. Diep looked up, startled. "I'm not letting you go because I agree," James said. "I'm letting you go because I love you enough to not trap you." Her face crumpled. "But," he added, voice turning steady, "I won't stop. Not the truth. Not you. I won't chase you like you're a mistake, and I won't pretend this goodbye is what I want." Diep shook her head, whispering, "James." He held her gaze. "If you walk out that door, I'll respect it. I won't follow you tonight." A sob caught in Diep's throat. She pressed her fist against her mouth for a second, trying to silence it. Then she reached into her bag with shaking hands and pulled out something small, an old keychain, worn at the edges, simple plastic, a tiny charm. "I kept this," she said, voice breaking. "From the first time you helped me, I told myself it didn't mean anything." James stared at it, his eyes softening. "It does," he whispered. Diep placed it into his palm, her fingers brushing his in a final, fragile contact. "When you finish what you're doing," she said, "when you've made your peace with the truth, if you still want to find me." James's breath stopped. "Then you'll know I didn't leave because I stopped loving you." Her voice shattered on the last word. "I left because I loved you too much to watch you drown." James curled his fingers around the keychain like it was the only solid thing left in the room. Diep turned. Each step she took toward the cafe door felt like a door closing inside his chest. He stood perfectly still because he'd promised. At the threshold, she paused just once without looking back. Then she walked into the rain. James remained under the warm, dim cafe light, palm tied around the tiny charm, eyes fixed on the wet street beyond the glass. Two people, two fates, and somewhere in the dark, the truth waited sharp enough to cut both of them.
Vào đêm khuya trong một quán cà phê yên tĩnh, Diệp nhẹ nhàng nói với James rằng họ nên chia tay, nhưng lời nói ấy như một phán quyết cuối cùng. James cầu xin cô ở lại, khẳng định anh có thể bảo vệ cô và giải quyết các vấn đề gia đình, nhưng Diệp lo sợ cho tình yêu của họ có thể làm tổn hại mối quan hệ của anh với cha mình, và cô không thể chịu đựng được một việc trở thành lý do khiến anh đánh mất mối quan hệ đó. Cô tiết lộ mình trân trọng tình cảm cha con đi nhường nào vì cô lớn lên mà không có cha mẹ. Khi James thừa nhận anh đã bí mật thu thập bằng chứng chống lại cha mình, nhưng tài liệu và chứng cứ có thể vạch trần sự thật, Diệp càng lo sợ hơn về nguy hiểm phía trước. James từ chối giam giữ cô lùi bước dù trái tim anh tan vỡ. Diệp để lại cho anh một chiếc móc khóa nhỏ như một lời hứa nếu anh vượt qua được cơn bão và vẫn muốn cô. Anh biết rằng cô chưa bao giờ ngừng yêu anh.